Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about police brutality and how it stems from the belief in the thin blue line. If you haven't already, remember to subscribe. It's been nearly a year since the murder of George Floyd by police officers, and in that year a lot has been said and done. We've seen a mass outpouring of anger in European and American societies. Ethnic minorities are still seen and treated as lesser by the police in those societies. I don't want to retread on arguments other YouTubers have made, so what I'm going to talk about is how police brutality fits into the growing ideology of the thin blue line. Now, a few months back, in response to a police officer tragically losing their life, a police force tweeted out a picture of a black background with a thin blue line. A leftist journalist pointed out that this is now a hate symbol, and of course, outrage erupted and the journalist was forced to apologise. This symbol has been spreading throughout police forces in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Several police officers I personally know have this symbol as their Facebook profile picture. It prevails in chats and is frequently adapted and plastered onto police cars and other similar places. Why is this important? Well, ideology is a big thing. What do people believe? Why do they believe it? These questions are at the heart of civil society and being able to understand, disagree and debate ideas. But before we get into the thin blue line, we first have to establish a few things. Why do police forces even exist? This is something I feel I need to talk a little about. There is currently an impression that the left wants to abolish police forces, which simply isn't so. Police forces have developed in the last few centuries. They are a relatively modern tool. After the early feudal era, where lords could have their own armed forces, their retainers were responsible for preserving order in their lands. It then passed to the king, who used soldiers to control the populace. Obviously, soldiers aren't trained to be gentle, so this often caused friction. In the mid to late 1800s, this then changed, with unarmed police officers starting to spread and the concept of policing by consent. So now that we understand why police forces exist, we've got to talk about what police brutality is. This is something that I see a lot of people talk about without actually thinking through what is being said. To most people, if you are arrested, you've done something wrong, or wrong enough to justify being questioned. So if you resist, you are therefore guilty. I understand that intuitive thought process, but as we see every single day, an arrest is not the same as a conviction, nor is every conviction always guaranteed to be safe. Nor is it fair when certain groups get arrested for little more than trumped up reasons repeatedly. Despite all the guidelines stating clear as day that you cannot arrest someone on the basis of skin colour, this has not changed, nor has it stopped. But what is police brutality? Simply, that's when the police use force they do not need to subdue or arrest a suspect during the course of their duties, or violent attacks against them or bystanders. Nice and succinct. It is the extra punch in the stomach, or slamming a suspect's head into the wall, or perhaps a headlock when they're already handcuffed. It's unnecessary. This isn't about a police officer tackling someone holding a knife or punching someone as they're holding a weapon as they try to subdue them. It's about the force they objectively do not need, which is clear and obvious. When police officers do this, it might seem like a little extra, that we don't need to worry about this, but this frays trust between the police and the community. It makes interactions with police officers from ordinary members of the public a lot harder. It creates an atmosphere of fear, where one did not and does not need to exist. And also bear in mind, it is unlawful. It might seem like a ridiculous idea, but surely those that are tasked with enforcing the law should not be above it. Random beatings for perceived disrespect, excessive force and even torture, rape and murder should not be something that our police forces engage in, because they are the enforcers of the law, not above it. There are two relevant philosophies here, policing by consent and policing by occupation. Policing by consent is the dominant philosophy in how the United Kingdom approaches policing, though it is unpopular amongst the ruling Conservative Party. It is the idea that the police are of the community, from within the community, and so should see themselves not as warriors or occupying soldiers, but civilian officers, attempting to ensure that the community's rules are adhered to. It is characterised by a heavy emphasis on de-escalation, a lack of weapons, and a more conciliatory approach towards community relations. It's not always perfect, and the police don't always get it right. At its core, it depends on the community's goodwill. It relies upon people seeing the police as a normal part of their community. Their local neighbourhood Bobby, the person you can have a laugh with as they walk their beat, approachable, understandable, and relatable. Wherever possible, they attempt to use minimally invasive tactics. They do not go in with full force unless it is justified, and try to minimise the amount of harm and damage caused by their approach. This is obviously not without its critics. It asks a lot of police officers and asks them to stay calm and de-escalate even when the situation is escalating. I've spoken to several police officers who in a dangerous situation had to try and de-escalate because they had no other means of defence against an armed attack. Obviously they were successful, but it is a risk to police officers' well-being. It is important to bear in mind that whilst a philosophical approach may say to do this, the British police often do make mistakes regarding use of force and their approach. It isn't to say that they're perfect by any means. It is also very unpopular, at least on the face of it, because it gives the impression of the police as somehow being soft on crime, or treating criminals with more respect than ordinary people, and that criminals don't deserve basic human rights. Its unpopularity is, I believe, overblown. I think if people had to face a more brutal, less approachable police force, they would quickly want a return to policing by consent, despite the current complaints against it, simply because most people want a police force that cracks skulls until they crack their skull for something they didn't do. Counterpoint, which seems to be the dominant philosophy in the United States, is the belief in policing by occupation. It isn't often spoken of in those words, but that is what it amounts to. It views the police not as of the community, but outside of it, tasked with enforcing law and order by any and all means necessary. It is the older form of policing in that they are occupiers, soldiers, warriors who stand amongst the community but are not of the community. Almost all police forces who subscribe to this form of ideology have armed police forces. This obviously escalates the situation rather than de-escalating it. If a police officer feels threatened enough, they're usually justified in firing their weapon. This naturally precludes attempts to de-escalate, as it often morphs into comply or face lethal force. It raises the stakes of a situation and puts the power of judge, jury and executioner into the hands of the police, even if it nominally doesn't mean to. Police officers are no longer approachable community members on the street, they are soldiers, intimidating warriors patrolling their patch of land. Now we need to take a slight detour here. Our current conception of the state is that the state has a monopoly on violence. That is, only the state is allowed to use violence in our society. You often hear this from Marxists, and it isn't a wrong assumption. What this means is that in order to enforce the rules of our society, the state is justified in allowing its actors to use force. This is often very closely tied to the social contract, because that usage of force must be qualified and must be appropriate. If the use of force is no longer qualified and appropriate, people start to revolt against arbitrary and cruel practices. So when the state has a monopoly on violence, it is a responsibility of the police to wield that power appropriately. Policing by occupation uses the idea that because anyone and everyone is a threat, that their standing orders are to hammer down the peg that stands out, that they are empowered by that monopoly of force to guarantee the rule of order in a much more aggressive fashion than if they were policing by consent. The difference is very similar to international relations in that countries can use their soft power through diplomatic means or their hard power in the form of their military. This distinction is important because it speaks to how we police our society. It speaks to the interactions we have with our justice system, and that informs our whole societal behaviour. It impacts how willing people are to protest, to express their beliefs and stand up for their rights and the rights of others. It affects how minorities teach their kids the behaviours of society. It determines how willing people are to work with the police. These things all add up. All these little implications have a huge effect on the laws we pass and whether the police act with restraint or without it. And for a lot of people, this is a life or death situation. Having established all of that, what is the thin blue line? The thin blue line is the belief that the only thing that stands between civilization and anarchy is the thin line of police that stand in the way. It's a reference to the thin red line, which was a term given during the Crimean War, where a very small unit of British soldiers held off a numerically superior force, and then the American novel and film of the same name referencing the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Second World War. It invokes the imagery of a group of desperate men fighting courageously against the seemingly endless hordes of the enemy. It is very telling that it references to desperate military actions. That's the literal definition, but what are the implications of this idea? It takes the belief in policing by occupation and ramps it up by 100. The police are now elevated to guardians of civilization, solemn, unthanked protectors of a sheep of society, tending ever watchfully against the lawless wolves outside. It emphasises the police's function as warriors and lessens the belief in de-escalation. It logically follows. If you're a soldier guarding the innocent and a barbarian is threatening them, you react with force, overwhelming force, to prevent them from doing so again. Apply this to all areas of policing and it justifies almost any action the police officer takes because that person refused to comply and threatened civilization. It's why police unions and other police officers are so reluctant to testify, implicate, or even hold to account other police officers, because whilst they'll admit that an individual officer may have acted egregiously and beyond acceptable bounds, to allow them to be punished is a threat to the authority of the police, and nothing that threatens the integrity of that line can ever be allowed to stand. This is why the few bad apples argument is so spectacularly wrong, because almost every police officer tacitly signs up to this belief that the integrity of the police force's authority comes first. This is why the same police officers you saw kneeling with BLM protesters were happy to beat and shoot at other protesters later. It's why police officers can be individually good people but still act in concert with other police officers who abuse their power. The concept of the thin blue line is a diametric opposite to policing by consent, and it sets the police force against the population in a much surer way, because as an occupying force, you are no longer of the community, you are no longer part of society. You don't speak to ordinary people as one of them on the beat, you speak to them with a paternalistic attitude that they are naive in their ignorance and must be saved from it. This philosophy creates an ever-widening divide and helps justify overuse of force and military tactics. It's why so many US police forces now have military-grade weapons and justify the continual use of those weapons as we're at war against crime, or we are outgunned or outmatched by the criminal hordes. Also, think of how this changes how the police view criminals. They go from people who have simply broken the rules and laws and need to be brought to justice, to a giant lawless threat to civilization who will infect others. It's the logic that underpins failed broken windows policing, that if you don't respond hard, firmly and fast against these lawless barbarians, we risk the integrity of civil society itself. This justifies any measure needed to maintain law and order. And that predominantly lands on minority communities. As I mentioned in the civil rights video, there is a lot of depth and nuance that governs why minorities interact with the police on a much more frequent basis than white people. However, it is very important to note that the police react more violently towards minorities. Numerous studies have shown clearly that implicit, unconscious bias still affects police officers even when they have training to improve minority relations. When you have that implicit bias, coupled with the historic reasons of poverty and high crime, you then have a perfect cocktail of toxicity, which results in the systematic abuse of minorities by the police force, and that is without touching upon explicit racism within police forces. These are just the systemic factors that fall into this and create this situation where this toxic cocktail causes pain, anguish and suffering in minority communities, and that results in lower cooperation, further unrest and more tension between communities and police forces. Furthermore, the thin blue line has increasingly been combined with the Punisher symbol. This is disturbing because you have to realise what the Punisher is. He is a vigilante, judge, jury and executioner. He is the representation that our police forces are no longer servants of society, of our community, who work as one part of the justice system, and are instead people who see themselves as doing the necessary dirty work from outside inwards. Anyone they judge as criminal is a legitimate target. We see it all the time in cop dramas and cop films, where you get this one heroic cop shooting up a crack den or a Mexican drug lord or some brown terrorist type. Even though this doesn't reflect the reality of policing, it gives this impression. It allows police to change their mindset into judge, jury and executioner, and now we're into the twilight zone where the lawless are professing to uphold the law.
I am the law!
This is all obviously very grim, so let's talk about positive reform. Defund the police is not a call to abolish the police. It is a call to reform the police budget system to divert funding away from the police who do not need that level of funding and move it towards social programs which will reduce the level of crime. How does this work? The general basis for these arguments is that the police forces are receiving ever larger portions of the budget and are sucking up funding away from mental health programs and other social networks that would prevent a person from falling into criminal behaviour. It's how you end up with someone obviously suffering from a mental health crisis who needs a trained response team having untrained, uncaring police officers responding and shooting the man dead, as what happened with Walter Wallace Jr., who was murdered by police officers a few months ago. This is what BLM and the Defund the Police movement is about. It's not about giving in to anarchy, it's about moving towards policing by consent and having the appropriate social services or training to deal with situations before they escalate to the police. However, the right are moving this discussion into one of either anarchy or heavy policing, and all the while this dangerous concept of the thin blue line continues to infect and pervade police forces across the United States and Britain. To conclude, I would say this: the way we police our citizenry is fraught with dilemmas from civil rights to collective security. But one thing we must always bear in mind is that our police forces have one of the most dangerous powers in our societal toolkit, the right to use force. And unless we are very, very careful in how they use that force, we are risking the undermining of our legal system, and it is our legal system that separates us from barbarism, not our police force. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, remember to share and subscribe. I'll see you next week for the normally scheduled release. Thank you and goodbye.